There is a person in your life you cannot stand. You know who it is. The name came to you before I finished the sentence. Maybe it's someone at work. Maybe it's a relative you see twice a year and count the hours until you can leave. Maybe it's someone you follow online for no reason except the small, sour satisfaction of disliking them. And here is the strange part. Other people don't seem to have this reaction. They find this person fine, tolerable. Sometimes they even like them, which means the intensity is not coming from the person. It's coming from somewhere in you. Carl Jung had an answer for this, and it is not a comfortable one. He believed that the people who irritate us most are not our enemies. They are our mirrors. That the specific trait you cannot tolerate in someone else is almost always a trait you have buried in yourself. Not because you don't have it, because you were taught somewhere along the way that you were not allowed to have it. Jung called this buried material the shadow, and he said something about it that most people never really absorb. Everyone has one, not just the cruel ones or the visibly broken ones. Everyone, including you, including the version of you that considers itself kind, reasonable, and self-aware. In fact, Jung would say the more certain you are that you don't have a dark side, the larger yours has probably grown. So, here is what I want to do in the next 40 minutes. I want to show you what the shadow actually is, where yours came from, and why the people who bother you are the closest thing you have to a map of it. And then, near the end, I'll give you the 3 questions Jung's framework points toward, not to fix you, to show you what you've been carrying. Fair warning, some of this is going to land uncomfortably close. That discomfort is not a sign you should stop. In Jung's view, it's the only reliable sign you're getting somewhere. Let's begin. Let's clear something up first, because the word has been badly damaged by the internet. The shadow is not your evil twin. It is not a demon living in your chest. It is not the part of you that wants to burn things down. Popular culture turned it into something theatrical, and in doing so, made it easy to dismiss. Most people hear shadow and picture a villain, decide they're not one, and move on. Jung meant something far more ordinary and far more inconvenient. The shadow is everything about yourself that you have refused to look at. That's it. That's the whole definition. It's the collection of traits, feelings, desires, and impulses that your conscious mind has decided are not acceptable and has therefore pushed out of view, not deleted, pushed out of view. There is an enormous difference between the two, and that difference is the reason this material keeps running your life. Jung wrote about it plainly in 1938. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Read that second half again, because it's the part people skip. The less you acknowledge it, the denser it becomes. The shadow doesn't shrink when you ignore it, it concentrates. Now, what actually lives in there? Some of it is what you'd expect. Anger you weren't allowed to express, envy you'd never admit to, selfishness, pettiness, the part of you that felt something other than joy when a friend succeeded. But here is where most people get it wrong, and this is important enough that I want you to hold on to it for the rest of this video. The shadow is not only made of bad things, it's made of anything that got rejected. And plenty of what gets rejected is good. Ambition in a family where wanting more was considered arrogance. Softness in a household where crying got you mocked. Creativity in a home where practicality was the only acceptable value. Confidence in a culture where standing out was dangerous. Anger, which is often the healthiest response available to a person being mistreated, but which many of us were punished for having. The Society of Analytical Psychology puts it well, drawing directly from Jung's collected works. The shadow contains not only morally questionable tendencies, but also normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, and creative impulses. And when these go unrecognized, they don't just sit there harmlessly. They leave the personality impoverished. They cut a person off from their own sources of energy. That's the real cost. Not that you have a dark side, that you've locked away parts of yourself you actually needed. Jung put this in a single line in his autobiography that I think about often. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. Substantial. That's the word he chose. He could have said good or pure or whole in some shining sense. He said substantial, as in having weight, as in actually being here. A person with no shadow is not a saint. A person with no shadow is a performance. And most of us, if we're honest, have spent a very long time perfecting that performance. So, how does a person end up with a shadow? Nobody chooses it. That's the first thing to understand. You didn't sit down one day and decide which parts of yourself to bury. It happened gradually, through thousands of small moments, most of which you don't remember. Think about what a child actually is when it arrives, a whole thing, undivided. A baby doesn't have a public self and a private self. It doesn't manage its image. When it's angry, the anger arrives completely. When it's delighted, the delight takes over the entire body. There is no gap between what it feels and what it shows, because it hasn't yet learned that such a gap is possible. And then it starts learning. It learns that certain expressions bring warmth, and others bring cold. That some feelings make the people it depends on move closer, and other feelings make them pull away. And for a small human whose survival depends entirely on those people staying close, this is not a small piece of information. It's everything. So the child begins to edit. There's nothing conscious or strategic about it. It happens the way water finds the path of least resistance. It notices that loud gets punished, so loud goes away. It notices that needing too much makes mother tired, so needing goes quiet. It notices that being the clever one earns approval, so cleverness gets amplified, while everything else waits in the hallway. Piece by piece, a self gets assembled, and the parts that didn't make it into that self don't vanish. They go somewhere. That somewhere is the shadow. I want to be careful here, because this is not a video about blaming your parents. Most of the editing wasn't done by cruel people. It was done by ordinary, tired, unaware people who were themselves edited decades earlier and never had the language to notice. Your mother's impatience with your neediness may have been her own buried neediness, flinching at the sight of itself. That's usually how it travels, not through malice, through inheritance. But understanding where it came from doesn't undo it. The editing still happened, and the result is that most adults are walking around as a curated version of themselves, having long ago forgotten there was ever an uncurated one. Jung called the curated version the persona, the mask. And he was careful to say the persona isn't the problem. You need one. Society doesn't function if everyone shows up completely unfiltered. The mask is a tool and a necessary one. The problem is when you forget you're wearing it, because then something strange happens. You start believing the mask is the whole of you. You start feeling genuine confusion about why you sometimes act in ways that don't match your self-image. Why you snapped at someone who didn't deserve it. Why you felt that flash of pleasure at someone else's failure. Why you sabotaged the thing you claim to want. Those moments aren't random. They're the buried material surfacing, briefly, and finding no conscious place to land. And the more rigidly you hold the mask in place, the harder that material pushes. This is why the most aggressively pleasant people are often the most exhausting to be around. Something underneath is straining. You can feel it even if you can't name it. The niceness has a pressure behind it, and the pressure is the effort of holding down everything the niceness doesn't allow. Jung said the shadow becomes blacker and denser the less it's acknowledged. This is what he meant. It's not that hidden parts turn evil, it's that hidden parts turn desperate. If the buried material can't come out directly, it comes out sideways. And it tends to use the same three exits. The first is the slip. The comment that leaves your mouth slightly sharper than you intended. The joke at someone's expense that lands harder than the room expected. Afterwards you think, I don't know why I said that. You do know. Something got past the guard while the guard was tired. The second is the overreaction. A small event produces a large response. Someone interrupts you, and you feel a surge of rage that would be appropriate for a much bigger offense. The size of the reaction tells you it wasn't really about the interruption. It landed on something already sore. The third is exhaustion. This is the one people never connect. Suppression is not free. Holding a portion of yourself out of view requires continuous low-level effort, running underneath everything else you do. Many people who describe themselves as inexplicably tired are not tired from their work. They're tired from the management, from the constant invisible labor of being a version of themselves. Jung's argument was that this energy is recoverable, not by unleashing everything you've buried, which is nobody's idea of a plan, but by knowing what's down there. The cost isn't in having a shadow, it's in not knowing you have one, and spending your life paying to keep the door shut. Now we come to the mechanism. This is the part of Jungian psychology with the most immediate practical value, and it's the reason I opened this video the way I did. Buried material does not stay buried quietly. It looks for a way out. And the way it usually finds is other people. Jung called this projection. And he described the effect in a line that I'd ask you to sit with for a moment. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Your own unknown face. The parts of yourself you don't have access to. Jung is saying that those parts don't stay inside. They get painted onto the world, and then you walk around reacting to your own reflection without knowing that's what you're doing. Here's how it works in practice. You meet someone. Within minutes, something about them grates on you. Not mild irritation, something sharper. A disproportionate response that you'd struggle to justify if someone asked you to explain it. Now, sometimes people are genuinely difficult, and your reaction is simply accurate. I'm not saying every irritation is a projection. That would be its own kind of trap, where you can never trust your own judgment about anyone. But there's a specific quality to projected irritation. And once you learn to recognize it, you can't unsee it. The reaction is out of proportion. Someone was slightly boastful and you're still thinking about it 3 days later. The size of the response doesn't match the size of the event. The reaction is oddly personal. It doesn't feel like that behavior is unfortunate. It feels like an offense, like they did something to you specifically. Other people don't share it. You mention it to a friend and they look at you blankly. They notice nothing. This is the clearest signal available, and most people dismiss it instead of examining it. You want them to be diminished, not corrected, diminished. There's a small hunger in you for them to be humbled, and it's slightly stronger than the situation warrants. When those 4 things line up, Jung's framework suggests you are almost certainly looking at yourself. Let me make this concrete, because abstraction is where this kind of material goes to die. Consider someone who cannot tolerate arrogance, who finds self-promotion genuinely offensive, who feels a physical tightening when a colleague talks about their own achievements. This person will tell you they simply value humility, and they might. But very often underneath, there is a buried desire to be seen, a hunger for recognition that was shamed out of them early, perhaps by a parent who mocked showing off, perhaps by a culture where standing out invited punishment. The desire didn't die, it got locked away. And now every time someone else lets that same desire walk around freely, something in them lurches. Because that person is doing the thing they were forbidden to do, and getting away with it. The irritation isn't about the other person's arrogance. It's about their freedom. Or consider someone who is contemptuous of neediness, who finds emotionally demanding people intolerable, who prides themselves on never being a burden. Underneath, there is usually a child who needed a great deal and learned that needing was dangerous. That child is still in there, still needing, and the sight of someone else needing openly is unbearable because it presses directly on a wound that was sealed rather than healed. Jung described the mechanism in a longer passage worth hearing in full. A man who is unconscious of himself acts in a blind, instinctive way, and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when he sees everything that he is not conscious of in himself coming to meet him from outside as projections upon his neighbor. Coming to meet him from outside. That's the image. You are walking through the world, encountering your own disowned material, wearing other people's faces, and experiencing it as though it has nothing to do with you. And here's the cruel efficiency of it. The more energy you spend maintaining your self-image, the more people you'll find intolerable. Because every trait you've exiled needs somewhere to go, and there is no shortage of humans willing to demonstrate it for you. Which means, and I want to say this carefully, your list of enemies is a document. It's a fairly reliable inventory of what you've refused to own. There's a second form of projection, and it's stranger than the first, because it doesn't feel bad at all. You can project the good material too. Think about the last time you admired someone to an unusual degree. Not ordinary respect, that slightly charged feeling where a person seems to possess something you could never possess. Where you find yourself thinking, I could never do that, or some people are just built differently. Jung would ask a pointed question about that. Where do you think you got the eye to recognize it? You cannot identify a quality you have no capacity for. The recognition itself is evidence. When something in another person makes you ache with admiration, that ache is usually pointing at a potential of your own that you've disowned. You buried it, decided it belonged to other people, and now you experience it from a distance as something enviable and unreachable. This is why hero worship can quietly stunt a person. As long as the quality lives in someone else, you never have to take responsibility for developing it in yourself. Admiration becomes a way of keeping your own potential at a safe distance, where it can be appreciated without being risked. And this is also why idealization so often collapses into contempt. The person you put on a pedestal eventually does something ordinary and disappointing, and the reaction is disproportionately harsh. Not because they failed, but because you handed them a piece of yourself and they didn't hold it well enough. Both directions of projection are the same mechanism. Something that belongs to you is living outside you, wearing another person's face. And whether you experience it as irritation or as awe, the effect is identical. It isn't available to you. Let me tell you about someone. He isn't a specific patient, and I'm not going to pretend he is. He's a composite, the kind of person Jungian analysts have described many times over. But he'll be recognizable, and that's the point. He is in his early 40s. He runs a small team. By most measures, he is doing well. And there is a younger man on his team who he cannot stand. The young man isn't incompetent. That's the frustrating part. He's actually good at the job. But he's casual about it. He doesn't stay late. He doesn't apologize for leaving on time. He speaks up in meetings without the careful hedging that everyone else uses. He asks for things directly. He once requested a raise in a tone that suggested he expected to get it, and he did. Our man finds this intolerable. He describes the younger man to his wife as entitled, as arrogant, as someone who hasn't earned his confidence. He notices himself scanning for the young man's mistakes. When one appears, he feels something he doesn't examine too closely. His wife, at some point, says something he doesn't want to hear. She says, "He doesn't seem that bad to me. That's the crack." That's where the four signals line up. The reaction is disproportionate. It's personal. Nobody else sees it. And he wants the young man humbled, not helped. Now, if he were to actually sit with this, in the way Jung's framework asks, here's what he might eventually find. He grew up in a house where you didn't ask. You waited. You worked. And if you worked hard enough, someone might notice. And if they noticed, you might receive. Asking directly was considered shameful. Wanting visibly was considered weak. He learned this so early that it stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like reality. So he built a life on it. 20 years of arriving early, staying late, doing excellent work, and waiting. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting for the recognition that his effort had surely earned. He never asked for a raise in his life. He was given them, eventually, and always slightly later than he deserved. And then this young man walks in and simply asks. Skips the 20 years of waiting. Gets what he wants without paying the price that our man believed was mandatory. The rage isn't about arrogance. It's about grief. It's the grief of a man realizing, somewhere below conscious awareness, that the price he paid was optional, that he could have asked, that there were 20 years of asking he never did, and he can't get them back. That's what was in the shadow. Not a monster, just a want. A completely ordinary human want, to be seen and to ask for things. Buried so early that it could only express itself as hatred of someone who still had it. This is what Jung meant when he called shadow work a moral problem. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Considerable moral effort. He didn't say insight, and he didn't say cleverness. He said effort. Because to see this clearly, our man would have to give up something he's been holding for 2 decades. The belief that his way was the right way, and that the young man is simply wrong. That belief is load-bearing. Remove it, and something in the structure has to be rebuilt. Most people don't do it. They keep the enemy instead. It's cheaper. I want to return to something I said early on, because it's the part of Jung's work that gets lost most often. And it changes the entire emotional weight of this material. The shadow is not a waste dump. It's a storage room. When our man buried his capacity to ask for things, he didn't bury a flaw. He buried an ability, a useful one. The ability to advocate for yourself is not a moral failing. It's a functional part of an adult life. He lost access to it not because it was bad, but because someone convinced him it was. Multiply that across a lifetime, and you start to see the real cost. The person who buried their anger didn't lose a defect. They lost their ability to detect mistreatment. Anger is, among other things, an alarm system. Disable it, and you will stay in situations you should have left years ago, wondering vaguely why you feel so tired. The person who buried their ambition didn't become humble. They became stuck, and then built a philosophy around the stuckness so it would feel chosen. The person who buried their softness didn't become strong. They became unreachable, and then wondered why intimacy never quite arrived. This is what Jung meant about the impoverished personality. Every exiled trait takes some of your energy with it, and it takes energy to keep it exiled. So you end up paying twice, once in lost capacity, once in the ongoing cost of suppression. And this is why Jung's most quoted line about darkness is not the grim statement people think it is. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. He wrote that in 1945, and he was arguing with a specific idea. There was, in his time as in ours, a popular spirituality that worked entirely upward. Focus on light. Think positive. Visualize the higher self. Jung's objection was not that light is bad, it's that you cannot get there by avoidance. The material you refuse to look at does not become less influential because you're looking at something nicer, making the darkness conscious. He isn't asking you to defeat it or purify it, only to make it conscious, to bring it into the light where you can actually see what it is. And here's what people find when they do, again and again. It's rarely as terrible as the fear suggested. The thing you spent 30 years not looking at usually turns out to be a frightened part of yourself that made a reasonable decision under bad conditions and never got told the conditions had changed. That's the gold, not some mystical treasure, just access. Access to parts of yourself that have been offline so long you forgot they were ever yours. I should be precise about the goal here, because the word integration gets used loosely and people form the wrong picture. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting on everything you find. If you discover buried rage, the answer is not to start expressing rage. If you find envy, the answer is not to announce it. That isn't integration. That's just handing the controls to material that has no experience driving. It also doesn't mean the trait disappears once you've seen it. People expect a kind of exorcism where clear sight dissolves the thing. It doesn't work that way. What changes is not the presence of the material, but your relationship to it. Here's the practical difference. Before, the trait operates without your knowledge. It selects your reactions, chooses your enemies, and shapes decisions you believe you're making freely. You experience the results as facts about the world. That person is insufferable. This situation is unfair. You never see the hand on the wheel because the hand is yours and you're not looking at it. After, the same material is still present, but now there's a small gap. The irritation arrives and something in you says, there it is again. You still feel it. You just aren't fully identical with it anymore. That gap is everything. It's the entire distance between being run by something and having a say in it. And it produces a specific kind of steadiness that's easy to recognize in people who have it. They're harder to provoke because provocation works by hooking unconscious material, and there's less of it lying exposed. They're less defensive about criticism because they've already met the worst of themselves and survived the meeting. They tend to be more tolerant of other people's flaws, having stopped pretending to be flawless. Jung believed this was the real work of the second half of life. The first half is spent building the persona, establishing yourself, becoming someone. The second half, if it goes well, is spent recovering everything the building cost you. That's not decline, it's a return. I'm not going to give you a program. Jung was skeptical of programs, and anyone who promises you shadow integration in 7 days is selling something. What I'll give you is 3 questions. They're derived from Jung's framework rather than lifted from a bedside routine he kept, and I want to be honest about that distinction. But they follow directly from everything we've covered, and they work. Take one. Not all 3. 1 is enough for a month. Question 1. Who am I disproportionately irritated by? And what exactly is the trait? Be specific. Not, she's annoying. What is the precise behavior? Name it in a single word if you can. Boastful, needy, lazy, loud, fake, greedy, reckless. The specificity matters because the vague version protects you. He's just difficult, leads nowhere. He takes up space without apologizing for it, leads somewhere immediately. Once you have the word, ask the follow-up. When was I punished for that exact trait? This won't produce something every time, and not everything traces back to childhood. But it happens often enough that it's worth checking. And when the memory arrives, it usually arrives fast and with more feeling than you expected. Question 2. What am I most eager for people to know about me? This one runs in the opposite direction, and it's sharper than it looks. Whatever you most want people to see is usually load-bearing. It's the part of the mask you're holding up hardest. And directly behind it, almost without exception, sits its opposite. The person who needs you to know they're generous is often managing something ungenerous. The person who insists they're low maintenance is often exhausted from suppressing needs. The person who tells you they don't care what anyone thinks has usually organized their entire life around it. This isn't an accusation. It's just how the structure works. You defend the wall that's thinnest. So, what do you most want understood about yourself? And what would it mean if the opposite were also true, some of the time? Question 3. What did I feel today that I decided not to feel? Small scale, daily, almost boring. You felt a flash of something and dismissed it within half a second. Envy when a friend shared good news. Relief at someone else's setback. Attraction you filed away. Anger you converted immediately into being reasonable. Those half-second dismissals are the shadow in real time, not buried in childhood. Happening now, today, in the small gap between feeling something and deciding you didn't. Catch one. Just one. Don't do anything with it. Don't act on it. Don't confess it. Don't fix it. Just let yourself have felt it for the length of a single breath before it goes. That's the whole practice. Feeling it without immediately editing it. This work is not therapy, and I am not offering it as therapy. If what surfaces is heavier than you can hold on your own, that's not a failure of yours. It's a signal to bring another person into it. Jung did this work with patients in a room over years, with support. He was explicit that some of this material is not safe to handle alone. So, go slowly. Curiosity, not excavation. You're not trying to break anything open. You're just turning towards something you've been standing with your back to. Let's return to where we started. There's a person you can't stand. And you've spent this video, I suspect, with them somewhere in the back of your mind, running the 4 checks. Disproportionate, personal, not shared by others, wanting them diminished. Maybe one of them landed. Maybe all 4. I want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't. It doesn't mean they're a good person. It doesn't mean your judgment is worthless or that you owe them anything. Projection and accurate perception can happen at the same time. And Jung never suggested you should stop assessing people. Some people genuinely are difficult, and noticing that is not a symptom. What it means is narrower and more useful. It means the intensity is yours. The behavior may be theirs. The heat is yours. And the heat is information, if you're willing to read it, about something you've been carrying without knowing. That's really all shadow work is. It isn't about becoming a better person, and it certainly isn't about defeating your dark side. It's slowly reclaiming the parts of yourself you handed over decades ago to people who told you they weren't acceptable. You were a child. You made a reasonable trade. You gave up pieces of yourself to stay close to the people you needed, because that's what children do, and it worked. You survived. But you're not there anymore. And the terms of that trade expired a long time ago, without anyone telling you. The parts you buried are still yours. They've been waiting, not to take over, just to be let back in. Jung spent his life arguing that wholeness is not the same as goodness, that a person who has met their own darkness is steadier than a person who has only ever performed light. Less reactive, harder to manipulate, less likely to hand their unexamined material to the world and then flinch at what comes back. That's what's on offer here, not perfection, substance. So, this week, notice one person. Notice the heat. And instead of doing what you've always done with it, ask the only question that actually goes anywhere. What is it in me that this is touching? You may not get an answer immediately. That's fine. The question does its work quietly, and it tends to answer itself when you're not looking directly at it. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, there's a new video here every day. No pressure. This channel isn't going anywhere. Take care of yourself. And be a little gentler with the person you can't stand this week. They're carrying one of these too.